Late at night in Stoneport, Nia Jackson stands tall in a packed courtroom, her grey suit crisp despite a brutal arrest. Officer Trent Carver, the racist cop who cuffed her, slumps, face pale, as the judge declares her the state's chief prosecutor. Charges drop, gasps echo, but Carver's faint smirk lingers. This victory feels hollow, a spark igniting a vicious war that will haunt Nia's future. What's he planning next? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. If justice drives you, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales. The fog rolled thick over Stoneport's docks, curling around the rusted cranes and weathered planks like a shroud. It was just past midnight, and the air carried the briny sting of the ocean, mingling with the faint diesel fumes from idling fishing boats. Nia Jackson, 42, moved with purpose through the mist, her sharp grey suit a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. Her briefcase, heavy with case files for a corruption trial she'd been prepping for weeks, swung lightly in her grip. She'd stayed late at a meeting with a whistleblower, a jittery dock worker who'd spilled secrets about payoffs in the mayor's office. Now her mind buzzed with strategies, her steps quick and deliberate, heels clicking against the uneven wood. She didn't notice the patrol car lurking at the edge of the pier until its headlights flared, cutting through the haze. Officer Trent Carver sat behind the wheel, a burly ex-Marine with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl etched into his square jaw. His pale blue eyes narrowed as he watched her, fingers drumming on the steering wheel. She was too polished, too out of place here among the roughnecks and salt-crusted nets. His gut twisted with something sour, a mix of suspicion and contempt. He muttered to himself, "What's she doing down here?" Then swung the door open, boots hitting the wet ground with a heavy thud. His partner, a wiry kid fresh out of the academy, stayed in the passenger seat, nose buried in his phone, oblivious to the storm brewing. Nia kept walking, her focus locked on the path ahead, until Carver's voice sliced through the night, low and gravelly. "Hold up there, ma'am!" She stopped, turning slowly, her expression calm but her dark eyes sharp, assessing him in an instant. He stood 6 feet tall, broad shoulders filling out his uniform, a hand resting lazily on his belt near the holstered gun. The fog swirled between them, thickening the tension. "Evening, officer," she said, voice steady, betraying no hint of the exhaustion tugging at her bones. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here this late?" Carver asked, stepping closer, his tone dripping with false courtesy. Nia tilted her head slightly, sizing him up. "Walking home from work. That a problem?" He smirked, a crooked twist of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Depends, this ain't exactly the place for a stroll in a fancy suit. Got ID on you?" She arched an eyebrow, shifting her briefcase to her left hand. "I'm not required to show ID unless you've got reasonable suspicion I've committed a crime." "Do you?" Carver's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He crossed his arms, stance widening, asserting dominance like a predator staking territory. "You're in a high-crime area, carrying a big old bag at midnight. That's suspicious enough for me." Nia held his gaze unflinching, her pulse quickening but her exterior cool as steel. "Suspicious how, exactly? Because I'm black and dressed well? You'll need more than that." His face darkened, jaw tightening, as her words landed like a slap. He leaned in, close enough for her to smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You got a mouth on you, I don't like it. Show me the ID or we've got a problem." She exhaled sharply through her nose, setting the briefcase down on the damp planks with deliberate care. "I'm a lawyer, I know my rights. You've got no grounds to detain me." That was the spark. Carver's patience snapped, his hand shooting out to grab her arm, fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. "Lawyer, huh? We'll see about that." Before she could pull away, he twisted her arm behind her back, the sudden jolt sending a spike of pain up her shoulder. She gasped, instinctively resisting, but he was stronger, slamming her against the patrol car's hood. The cold metal bit into her cheek as he yanked her other wrist back, snapping handcuffs on with a vicious click. Her briefcase tipped over, spilling papers into the wind, legal notes fluttering like wounded birds across the pier. "This is illegal," she shouted, voice cutting through the fog, sharp with fury. "You're making a mistake." Carver yanked her upright, his grip iron tight on her cuffed wrists, and shoved her toward the open back door of the car. "Tell it to the judge, sweetheart. You're mine now." She stumbled, heels catching on a splintered board, but caught, herself head high even as her heart pounded. A cluster of dock workers, bleary-eyed and bundled in oil-stained jackets, emerged from the shadows, drawn by the commotion. One, a grizzled man with a grey beard, stepped forward, frowning. "What's going on? She ain't done nothing." Carver spun, boots splashing in a puddle, his voice a barked command. "Back off, police business!" The workers hesitated, murmuring among themselves, but didn't advance. Nia met the bearded man's eyes as Carver forced her into the back seat, her tone calm despite the chaos. "Thank you, keep watching." The door slammed shut, locking her in with a hollow clang. Inside, the car smelled of sweat and cheap vinyl, the partitions smudged with grime. Carver climbed into the driver's seat, glancing at her through the rearview mirror, his smirk back, in full force. "Not so tough now, are you?" She didn't reply, her hands clenched into fists behind her, nails digging into her palms. Her mind raced, cataloguing every move he'd made, every word he'd spat. He'd targeted her for her race, her poise, her refusal to bow. This wasn't just a power trip, it was personal, and she could feel the venom in his stare. The partner finally looked up from his phone, blinking at the scene like he'd just woken up. "Trent, you sure about this? She don't look like trouble." Carver snorted, starting the engine with a rough turn of the key. "She's trouble, all right. Too well dressed for this dump. Probably smuggling something in that bag." The car lurched forward, tires crunching over gravel as they pulled away from the docks. Nia's scattered papers vanished into the fog, swallowed by the night. She stared out the window, watching the blurred shapes of cranes and boats recede, her jaw tight. This wasn't random. Carver had seen her, a black woman in a suit, and decided she didn't belong. His words echoed in her head, "You'll learn your place." She'd heard that tone before, in courtrooms, in back rooms, from men who thought power came with a badge or a gavel. But she wasn't some dockside nobody he could bully. She was Nia Jackson, chief prosecutor of the state, and she'd spent 20 years dismantling men like him. Her briefcase was gone, her arm throbbed where he'd gripped her, and her wrists ached under the cuffs, but her resolve hardened like tempered steel. She'd fight this not with fists but with the law, her sharpest weapon. The patrol car rumbled through Stoneport's empty streets, neon signs flickering in the distance, casting eerie glows on the wet pavement. Carver hummed tunelessly, a smug little melody that grated on her nerves. He thought he'd won, thought he'd put her in her place. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Nia leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment, forcing her breathing to steady. She pictured her office, her desk stacked with files, the framed photo of her son Jamal grinning at a basketball game. She'd built a life, a career, clawing her way up from nothing, and she'd be damned if this thug in a uniform took it from her. The station loomed ahead, a squat brick building with flickering lights, its shadow stretching across the road, like a predator waiting to pounce. Carver pulled into the lot, killing the engine with a jerk. He twisted around, meeting her gaze through the partition, his smirk widening. "Welcome to my world. Hope you like it." She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stared back with eyes that promised retribution. He'd crossed a line and she'd make sure he paid for it. The door opened, and he hauled her out, his grip bruising her arm again as he marched her toward the entrance. The night air was cold, biting at her exposed skin, but she stood tall, shoulders squared. The dock workers' faces flashed in her, mind witnesses to this outrage. She'd need them later, need their story. For now she was alone, cuffed and at his mercy, but not for long. Carver shoved her through the station doors, the buzz of fluorescent lights and the chatter of radios swallowing them whole. She stumbled slightly, catching herself against a wall, and he laughed, a harsh bark that echoed down the hall. "Move. We've got paperwork to do." Nia straightened, her mind already shifting gears. This was just the beginning. He thought he'd broken her, thought he'd won the night. He was wrong. She'd turn his game against him, piece by piece, until he was the one in cuffs. The war had started, and Nia Jackson didn't lose wars. The Stoneport police station squatted under a bruised sky, its brick walls streaked with grime, and its windows glowing with a sickly yellow light. Inside, the air was thick with the tang of sweat and burnt coffee, the hum of radios crackling over the shuffle of boots on scuffed linoleum. Nia Jackson stood at the booking desk, wrists still raw from the cuffs Trent Carver had snapped on too tight, her grey suit now wrinkled, but her posture unyielding. Her sharp eyes flicked across the room, taking in the chaos. Officers hunched. Over desks, phones ringing unanswered, a drunk slumped in a corner muttering curses. Carver loomed beside her, his meaty hand clamped on her elbow, guiding her like a prize he'd hunted down. He leaned toward the desk sergeant, a paunchy man with a grey mustache, and barked, "Got a troublemaker here." Caught her skulking around the docks, mouthing off. His voice carried, loud enough to draw smirks from a trio of cops nearby, their laughter a low rumble that prickled Nia's skin. She straightened, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I'm a lawyer. This arrest is baseless. Check my credentials." Carver's smirk twisted into a sneer, his grip tightening until she felt the bruise blooming beneath her sleeve. "Think she's a big shot," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Probably some activist with a fake badge." Sergeant barely glanced up, scribbling on a clipboard with a bored grunt. "ID?" Nia nodded toward her coat pocket, where Carver had stuffed her badge case after the arrest. He fished it out, tossing it onto the desk with a dismissive flick, like it was trash he'd scraped off his boot. The sergeant flipped it open, squinting at the embossed name, Nia Jackson, Chief Prosecutor. His eyebrows twitched, but before he could speak, Carver snatched it back, shoving it into his own pocket. "She's lying. Process her." Nia's pulse hammered, but her face stayed stone cold. "That's evidence of my identity. You're breaking protocol." Carver laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the walls. "Protocol? You're in my house now." He jerked her toward a hallway, past a row of flickering lights and peeling paint, the jeers of his buddies trailing behind like a pack of hyenas. They reached a holding cell, a cramped box with a rusted metal bench and a pipe dripping murky water onto the concrete floor. Carver shoved her inside, the door slamming shut with a clang that rattled her teeth. "Enjoy the stay," he said, his smirk back in full force as he turned the key. "You'll learn to shut up soon enough." She stood tall, refusing to sit, her eyes locked on him through the bars. "You're digging a hole, officer. Keep going." He chuckled, walking off, his boots thudding down the corridor. Alone now, Nia let her shoulders relax just a fraction, her mind racing. The cell smelled of mold and despair, the drip-drip of the pipe a maddening rhythm. She wasn't new to injustice, had seen it chew up lives in courtrooms and back alleys, but this was different. This was her, cuffed and caged, targeted for the color of her skin and the cut of her suit. Carver's words gnawed at her. "Thinks she's a big shot." It wasn't just arrogance, it was hate, pure and raw, and she knew it ran deeper than one bad cop. Footsteps approached, lighter this time, hesitant. A young officer, barely 20, with a mop of sandy hair and nervous. Eyes appeared at the bars. "Ellis," his name tag read. He clutched her badge case, glancing over his shoulder like a kid sneaking candy. "Ma'am," he whispered, voice trembling, "this says you're the chief prosecutor. Is it real?" Nia stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Yes, and that man's breaking every rule in the book." Ellis swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'll tell him." He scurried off, leaving her alone again. Minutes later, Carver stormed back, Ellis trailing behind like a scolded puppy. "What's this kid yapping about?" Carver snapped, snatching the badge from Ellis's hand. He glared at it, then at Nia, his jaw clenching so tight she could hear his teeth grind. "Fake or not, you're staying put," he growled, shoving it back into his pocket. "Nobody talks to me like that," and walks away. Nia's lips curved into a faint, steely smile. "You'll regret this," he snorted, turning to Ellis. "Get back to work, rookie. She's mine tonight." Ellis hesitated, then shuffled, off, casting a guilty glance her way. Carver lingered, leaning against the bars, his breath fogging the cold metal. "Big words for a nobody in a cage," he said, voice low and venomous. "You think you're special. You're nothing here." He stalked off, leaving her with the drip of the pipe and the distant buzz of the station. Nia paced the cell, 3 steps one way, 3 back, her heels clicking against the wet floor. She'd faced down crooked judges, smug defendants, entire systems rigged against her. But this was a new beast. Carver wasn't just a cop. He was a symbol of something rotten, something she'd spent her career fighting. Her mind shifted to her son, Jamal, 16 and lanky, probably sprawled on the couch at home with his headphones on. Then it hit her. A jolt of ice down her spine. The arrest. The docs. Someone could have filmed it. She stopped pacing, heart thudding. If that video got out, Jamal would see it. He'd panic, call her, wonder why she wasn't answering. She pressed her forehead against the bars, the metal cold against her skin, and whispered to herself, "Stay calm, baby. I'm coming." She couldn't call him, couldn't reach anyone. Her phone was in evidence, her briefcase lost to the wind. She was trapped, cut off, and Carver knew it. The station's noise faded as the night dragged on, officers trickling out, leaving only the hum of a vending machine and the occasional cough from a drunk in another cell. Nia sat finally back straight against the bench, refusing to let the damp seep into her bones. She replayed every moment, Carver's sneer, his bruising grip, the way he dismissed her badge. It wasn't just power, it was racial venom, a man who saw her as less than human because of her skin. She'd faced that hate before, but never this raw, never this close. Her fingers curled into fists, nails biting her palms. She'd make him pay, not with rage, but with the law, her sharpest blade. But first she had to get out. The cell door rattled suddenly, startling her. A shadow moved, too quick to catch, then silence. She stood, peering into the dim hall. But no one came, a prank, a threat. Her gut twisted. Carver wasn't done with her yet. She was still his prisoner, and he'd make sure she felt it. What do you think about Nia's fight against this kind of hate? Comment number 1 if you believe she'll turn the tables on Carver. Hit like if you're rooting for her strength. And subscribe to catch every twist in her battle for justice. Can she outsmart a system stacked against her? Or will Carver's next move bury her deeper? What's waiting for her beyond these bars? Morning broke over Stoneport with a sluggish grey light, the fog thinning to reveal the town's jagged edges. Crumbling warehouses, salt-eaten docks, and streets slick with last night's rain. Nia Jackson stepped out of the precinct at 7, her grey suit creased, her arm throbbing where Carver's grip had left a purple bloom. The desk sergeant had muttered something about insufficient evidence and cut her loose, shoving her phone and an empty evidence bag into her hands. Her briefcase was gone, lost to the wind, but she'd walked out with her head high, thinking she'd dodged the worst. She was wrong. The air outside was cold, biting at her exposed wrists, but she barely noticed, her mind already shifting gears. She'd file a complaint, gather witnesses from the docks, make Carver rue the day he'd crossed her. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she headed for her car, parked 2 blocks away from the station. She didn't see the storm brewing until her phone buzzed, a sharp vibration that jolted her from her thoughts. She fished it out, the screen lighting up with a flood of notifications, texts, emails, voicemails, all piling up like debris after a wreck. Her son Jamal's name flashed first, a frantic message. "Mom, what's happening? Call me." Her stomach dropped. She swiped through, and there it was, a link from an unknown number. She tapped it, and the screen filled with a grainy photo. Her mugshot, eyes wide, hair mussed. The precinct's stark background framing her like a criminal. Below it, a headline screamed in bold red letters on a local hate blog. "Thug lawyer busted at docks." The post was vile, a spew of racist venom calling her a ghetto fraud and uppity trash, claiming she'd been caught smuggling drugs. Comments piled up, each uglier than the last. Send her back where she came from, typical, hang her high. Her breath caught, a cold fist squeezing her chest. This wasn't random. Carver's smirk from the courtroom flashed in her mind, that faint twist of his lips when the charges dropped. He'd done this. She scrolled, hands trembling, and found a timestamp, posted at 3 in the morning, hours after her arrest, while she'd sat in that dripping cell. Her phone buzzed again, a call from her assistant, Lena, voice tight with panic. "Nia, it's everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, even the news picked it up. You okay?" Nia forced her voice steady, though her pulse hammered. "I'm fine, I'll handle it." She hung up, shoving the phone into her pocket, and quickened her pace. The streets were waking up now, fishermen hauling crates, shopkeepers flipping signs to open, and she felt eyes on her, real or imagined, boring into her back. She reached her car, a sleek black sedan parked under a flickering street lamp. Hands stopped dead. The driver's window was a spiderweb of cracks, a jagged hole punched through the center. A brick lay on the hood, scrawled with black marker, "Know your lane." She stood frozen, the words searing into her brain. This was no coincidence. Carver hadn't just leaked the mugshot, he'd unleashed a mob. She yanked the car door open, sweeping the brick aside with a clatter, and slid inside. The engine roared to life and she peeled out, tires squealing against the wet asphalt. Her office was 10 miles away, a glass-walled building overlooking the bay, and she needed to get there, regroup, strike back. But the drive was a gauntlet. Her phone kept buzzing, a relentless swarm of hate, death threats, slurs, a photo of her house with a red X over the door. She muted it, knuckles white on the wheel, and focused on the road. By the time she pulled into the parking garage, her jaw ached from clenching. She strode into the office, past the receptionist's wide-eyed stare, and into the open bullpen, where her team worked. The chatter died the moment she appeared, head swiveling, whispers rippling like a tide. Lena rushed over, a tablet in hand, her brown eyes dark with worry. "Nia, the blog's got 50,000 hits already. Clients are calling, asking if it's true." Nia set her jaw, forcing calm into her voice. "It's a lie, I'll fix it." But the doubt in their faces stung, a silent question. Could their chief prosecutor, their rock, really be this tarnished? She retreated to her corner office, slamming the door, and sank into her chair. The bay sparkled outside, mocking her with its serene blue while her world burned. She booted up her laptop, the hate blog glaring back at her, and traced the IP. It linked to a dummy account, untraceable without a warrant, but she knew Carver's prints were all over it. She'd prove it, nail him to the wall. Her resolve hardened, a steel rod in her spine. She'd faced worse, climbed higher. This wouldn't break her. She grabbed her coat, determined to confront him, get an apology, start the fight. The station was a 20-minute drive, and she stormed in, heels echoing off the linoleum like gunfire. Carver lounged at the front desk, sipping coffee, his buzz cut glinting under the lights. He looked up, smirking as she approached. "Well, look who's back," he drawled, setting the mug down with a deliberate clink. "Miss me?" Nia planted her hands on the desk, leaning in, voice low and lethal. "You leaked that mugshot. I want an apology now, or I'll bury you in court." His smirk widened, eyes glinting with malice. "Prove it was me, hotshot. You got nothing." She straightened, fury boiling, but kept her tone ice cold. "I've got witnesses, evidence. You're done." He laughed, a slow, mocking roll that made her skin crawl. "Good luck with that. Run along now." She turned to leave, every muscle taut, when a crash shattered the silence. A brick sailed through her car window again, parked just outside, glass exploding across the lot. She spun, heart slamming against her ribs, and saw the note taped to it fluttering in the breeze. "Know your lane." Carver didn't move, didn't flinch, just sipped his coffee, his smirk a silent taunt. She stormed out, snatching the note, her hands shaking with rage. The lot was empty, no witnesses this time, just the echo of his laughter behind her. She slid into the car, glass crunching under her feet, and gripped the wheel. The threats, the blog, the bricks, it was all him, a racist vendetta to tear her down. She'd thought she was free, thought the cell was the end. She was wrong. This was war, and Carver was playing dirty. She drove off, the note crumpled in her fist, her mind racing. She'd go public, call a press conference, expose him. She'd fought bigger monsters, won tougher battles. But as she merged onto the coastal highway, a pickup truck roared up behind. Her tailgating, its horn blaring. She glanced in the rearview, saw a Confederate flag sticker on its bumper, and her blood ran cold. The truck swerved, clipping her fender, and she jerked the wheel, tires screeching. It sped off, leaving her breathless, the note's words burning in her head. "Know your lane." This wasn't just Carver anymore. He'd unleashed something bigger, something uglier, and it was coming for her. She pulled into a gas station, hands trembling as she parked and stared at the cracked windshield. Her phone buzzed again, Jamal's voice breaking through on a voicemail. "Mom? People at school saw it. They're saying stuff. Where are you?" She closed her eyes, guilt and fury warring in her chest. She'd vowed to protect him, shield him from this hate. Now it was at their door. She started the car again, resolve hardening like granite. Carver wanted a fight? He'd get one. She'd gather evidence, rally her team, hit back twice as hard. But as she drove, the truck's flag lingered in her mind, a shadow of what was coming. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Stoneport courthouse loomed like a weathered fortress, its stone facade stained by decades of coastal storms, its tall windows glinting under a noon sun that burned away the morning's fog. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. The gallery, packed with reporters, locals, and a smattering of Nia Jackson's allies, their murmurs a low hum against the creak of wooden benches. Nia stood at the defendant's table, her grey suit pressed despite the chaos of the past 12 hours, her dark eyes blazing with a quiet fury that could melt steel. Her wrist still bore faint red marks from Carver's cuffs, and her arm ached where bruises bloomed. But she held herself like a queen, unshaken by the hate blog's venom or the brick through her window. Across the room, Officer Trent Carver strutted in, his uniform crisp, his buzz cut gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His pale blue eyes flicked over the crowd, a smirk tugging at his lips, radiating a confidence that said he owned this town. He'd built his story. Nia was a suspicious figure, a threat to public safety, and he'd acted in duty. The judge, a wiry man with a hawkish nose and sharp glasses perched low, banged his gavel, silencing the room with a crack that echoed off the high ceiling. "Order," he snapped, voice dry as old paper. "We'll hear the state's case against Miss Jackson." Carver took the stand, adjusting his tie with a theatrical flourish, his posture rigid, but his tone smooth as oil. "I was on patrol. Near the docks," he began, eyes locking on the jury. 6 locals who shifted uneasily under his gaze. "Saw her walking alone, late, in a high-crime area. She had a bag full of papers, wouldn't show ID, got hostile when I asked questions. My duty's to keep Stoneport safe. Her behavior raised red flags, so I made the arrest." He paused, letting the words sink in, his smirk flickering as he glanced at Nia. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable, a predator sizing up prey. The state's attorney, a young woman with a tight bun and nervous hands, stood, her voice clipped. "Officer Carver, you said her behavior was suspicious. What specific actions justified the arrest?" Carver hesitated just a beat, then leaned forward. "She was out of place, too fancy for the docks, defensive when I approached, refused to cooperate." The attorney pressed. "So, your suspicion was based on her appearance and location?" Carver's jaw tightened, his confidence wavering. "Yeah, and her attitude, she didn't belong there." The attorney nodded, stepping back. "No further questions." Nia rose slowly, the scrape of her chair against the floor drawing every eye. Her heels clicked softly as she approached the podium, her presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. "Your Honor," she said, voice calm but resonant, "I request to represent myself." The judge peered over his glasses, intrigued. "You sure, Miss Jackson?" She nodded, unwavering. "Yes. It'll move this along." He waved a hand, granting permission, and she adjusted the microphone, her gaze locking onto Carver. He shifted, unease creeping into his stance, but that smirk lingered, daring her to try. "Officer Carver," she began, her tone measured, each word a scalpel, "you said my behavior was suspicious. Would you agree suspicion requires specific, articulable facts?" Carver swallowed, throat bobbing. "Yeah." She stepped closer, her voice sharpening. "Yet your testimony rests on vague impressions. My clothes, my location. Is there a law against walking in public while dressed professionally?" His face reddened, hands gripping the stand. "No, but—" She cut him off, smooth as glass. "Let's move on. You claimed I refused to cooperate. Did I not tell you I'm a practicing attorney and that your actions were illegal?" Carver's eyes darted to the jury, then back. You said something like that, but anyone can claim anything. Her lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. True. So why didn't you verify my identity when I offered my credentials? Silence fell, thick and heavy. Carver fumbled in his pocket, producing her badge case, its leather worn but the gold lettering clear. He handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. The room held its breath as the judge opened it, his sharp eyes scanning the text. His expression softened, then hardened with recognition. Miss Jackson, he said, voice low, this confirms you're the chief prosecutor of the state. A gasp rippled through the gallery, heads whipping toward Carver, whose face drained of color, his smirk vanishing like smoke. Nia turned back to him, her eyes now a blaze of controlled rage. Officer Carver, did you contact your superior to verify my identity after I told you who I was? He stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. I didn't think it was necessary. Her voice sliced deeper. So you detained me, humiliated me, and spun a story to cover it, all without checking. Is that your idea of public safety? The tension was a live wire crackling through the room. Carver looked to the judge, the jury, but found no lifeline. He was exposed, floundering. Nia faced the judge, her tone resolute. Your Honor, I request the charges be dismissed and an internal affairs probe into Officer Carver's conduct. This is abuse of power, plain and simple. The judge nodded, his gavel poised. Motion granted, charges dismissed. Officer Carver, your actions will be reviewed. The crack of the gavel was a thunderclap, the crowd erupting in whispers and gasps. Nia stood tall, victory pulsing through her veins, and walked back to her table, head high. Carver slumped on the stand, his uniform suddenly too tight, his confidence shattered. She'd dismantled him, turned his lies to ash with precision and poise. She gathered her papers, feeling the room's eyes on her, some awed, some wary. This was her moment, a crack in the wall of hate he'd built. She stepped outside, the sea breeze sharp against her skin, and took a deep breath. She'd won, reclaimed her name. The blog's venom, the bricks, they'd fade under this truth. She started toward her car, the cracked windshield a badge of survival, when a shadow moved at the courthouse edge. Carver stood there, whispering to a man in a dark coat, his voice too low to catch. She's done, he muttered, and the man nodded, slipping away. Nia froze, a chill slicing through her triumph. His smirk from the courtroom flashed back, that faint, knowing twist. This wasn't over. He wasn't broken, he was plotting. Her win was a spark, not the fire's end. What do you think of Nia's courtroom smackdown? Comment number 1 if you agree Carver's getting what he deserves. Hit like if her strength blows you away, and subscribe to see how she fights back next. Was this victory worth the cost, or did she just paint a bigger target on her back? What's Carver cooking up in the shadows? The moon hung low over Stoneport, a pale sliver casting weak light across the jagged cliffs that framed Nia Jackson's seaside home. It was just past midnight, the air thick with salt and the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore. Inside, the house was quiet, a two-story sanctuary of clean lines and warm wood, its windows dark except for a faint glow from the living room where Nia had fallen asleep on the couch. Her grey suit jacket lay draped over a chair, her shoes kicked off by the door, and a glass of untouched water sat on the coffee table beside her. The courtroom wind still thrummed in her veins, a hard-earned triumph that had left her exhausted but hopeful. She'd texted Jamal, her 16-year-old son, to lock up and go to bed, promising they'd talk in the morning about the chaos he'd seen online. She'd drifted off, believing the worst was behind her, that justice had flexed its muscle in that courtroom. She was wrong. A crash jolted her awake, the sound of shattering glass ripping through the silence like a gunshot. She bolted upright, heart slamming against her ribs, eyes darting to the source. The back door, now a gaping hole of jagged edges, the night spilling in. Footsteps thudded, heavy and fast, and before she could stand, 3 figures burst into the room, masked in black balaclavas, their gloved hands clutching crowbars and cans of spray paint. Nia lunged for the baseball bat she kept under the couch, a relic from Jamal's Little League days, her fingers closing around the smooth wood as the first thug charged. "Get out!" she shouted, voice raw, swinging the bat in a wide arc. It caught his shoulder with a sickening crack, sending him stumbling back. But the other two were on her in an instant. One grabbed her arm, twisting it until the bat clattered to the floor, while the second slammed her against the wall, her head snapping back with a thud that blurred her vision. Pain flared hot and sharp, but she kicked out, her bare foot connecting with a shin, earning a grunt from her attacker. Upstairs, Jamal's bedroom door creaked open, his lanky frame peering down the hall, eyes wide with terror. "Mom!" he yelled, voice breaking, and started for the stairs. "Stay there!" Nia screamed, thrashing against the grip pinning her. "Hide!" He froze, then darted back, slamming the door as the thugs turned their attention to the room. They moved with purpose, smashing picture frames, overturning the oak bookshelf, its contents spilling across the hardwood like fallen soldiers. One pulled a can from his belt, red paint hissing as he sprayed racial slurs across the cream walls, jagged, hateful words that burned into Nia's brain. She lunged again, breaking free for a moment, but a crowbar swung low, clipping her knee. She crumpled, pain exploding up her leg, and the thug loomed over her, his breath hot through the mask. "Stay down," he growled, voice muffled but thick with menace. She glared up, defiant, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where she'd hit the wall. "You're cowards," she spat, voice steady despite the ache. He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and kicked the bat away, joining his partners as they tore through the house. They ripped cushions, smashed the TV, and in the kitchen, yanked drawers out, scattering silverware with a clatter. Nia dragged herself to her feet, limping to the coffee table where her phone lay. She snatched it, dialing 911, her voice low and urgent. "Home invasion, 32 Cliffside Drive, hurry." The operator's calm questions faded as footsteps pounded back toward her. She dropped the phone, spinning just as a thug raised his crowbar. She ducked, the metal whistling, past her ear, and stumbled toward the stairs, calling for Jamal. "I'm okay, stay hidden." The attackers didn't follow, instead grabbing a stack of files from her office nook, case notes she'd brought home after losing her briefcase. They doused them with lighter fluid from a pocket flask, and a match flared, the papers igniting. With a whoosh, flames licked up the wall, smoke curling thick and acrid as they bolted out the broken door, vanishing into the night. Nia staggered to the kitchen, grabbing a fire extinguisher from under the sink, and sprayed foam over the blaze, choking on the fumes. The fire died, leaving charred remnants and a blackened streak on the plaster, but the damage was done. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as red and blue lights flashed through the shattered windows. She sank to the floor, chest heaving, blood and sweat mixing on her face. Jamal crept downstairs, his basketball jersey rumpled, eyes red with fear. "Mom, what's happening?" he whispered, dropping beside her. She pulled him close, ignoring. The pain in her knee, her voice firm. "We're okay, that's what matters." He nodded, trembling, and she held him tighter, her mind racing. This wasn't random. The slurs, the files, the timing, it screamed Carver. He'd lost in court, and this was his answer, a racist gut punch to her home, her family. The front door banged open, two officers storming in, guns drawn, their boots crunching glass. Nia recognized them instantly. Hargrove and Diaz, Carvers, buddies from the precinct, their faces etched with the same smugness she'd seen at booking. "Clear," Hargrove shouted, holstering his weapon, his bald head gleaming under the lights. Diaz, lean and sharp-eyed, scanned the wreckage, his lips twitching. "Looks like a break-in. Random, probably." Nia stood, wincing as her knee buckled, and faced them, her voice ice-cold. "Random? With slurs on my walls and my files burned? You're lying." Hargrove shrugged, crossing his arms. "No evidence of anything else. We'll file a report." Diaz crouched by the charred pile, poking it with a pen, then stood. "Could be kids. Happens around here." Nia's eyes narrowed, catching a glint on the floor. A knife dropped in. The chaos, its handle smudged with prints. She pointed, her tone lethal. "That's evidence, bag it." Hargrove smirked, picking it up with a gloved hand, but his eyes flickered with something uneasy. "Sure, we'll check it." They left, the report in hand, and Nia knew it had vanished, buried by Carver's reach. She locked the door behind them, leaning against it, her breath ragged. Jamal hovered nearby, clutching a blanket she'd draped over him. "Mum, was this because of that cop?" She nodded, jaw tight. "Yeah, he's not done with me." She limped to the couch, sinking down, and pulled up her phone. The screen cracked but working. A text from Lena glowed. "Heard about court, you okay?" She typed back, "No. Home hit. Need you tomorrow." The knife nagged at her, a thread to pull. If those prints were Carver's, she'd have him. But Hargrove's smirk lingered in her mind, a promise of cover-up. She looked at Jamal, his face pale, and felt a stab of guilt. She'd won in court, thought she'd struck a blow, but this was the cost. Her sanctuary violated, her son terrorized, hate painted on her walls. The slurs glared back, red and raw, a declaration of war. She stood, ignoring the pain, and grabbed a marker from the debris, crossing out the words with thick black lines. "Not in my house," she muttered, each stroke a vow. Carver had escalated, turned her win into a nightmare, and she knew he'd orchestrated it, his cronies shielding him. She'd thought the courtroom was the battlefield, but it was here, in her burning home, that the real fight began. She'd protect Jamal, rebuild, hit back harder. But as she stood amid the wreckage, the sea wind whistling through the broken door, a chill settled in her bones. Carver wasn't just a cop, he was a machine of vengeance, and this was his opening salvo. The morning sun crept over Stoneport's cliffs, painting the sea a dull gold. But inside Nia Jackson's home, the light only deepened the shadows of ruin. The back door was boarded up, the charred walls scrubbed raw, and the air still stank, of smoke and paint thinner. Nia stood in the kitchen, her grey suit swapped for a black sweater and jeans, her knee wrapped in a brace that creaked with every step. Jamal slept upstairs, exhausted from the night's terror, his soft snores a fragile lifeline in the wreckage. She'd spent hours cleaning, scrubbing slurs off the walls until her hands bled, but the hate lingered, a ghost she couldn't erase. Her phone buzzed on the counter, Lena's name flashing. "Filing the lawsuit today," the text read. "Carver's going down." Nia nodded to herself, a spark of resolve flaring. She'd rebuild from the invasion, turn that knife's prints into a noose around his neck. She brewed coffee, the bitter scent grounding her, and sat at the table, drafting a press statement on her cracked laptop. "This is war," she typed, "and I'll fight it with everything I've got." She thought she was gaining ground, clawing back control. She was wrong. A sharp knock rattled the front door, followed by a shout, "Police, open up!" Nia froze, coffee spilling across the table, dark tendrils soaking her notes. She limped to the window, peering through the blinds, and saw a SWAT team fanned out across her lawn, black vests glinting, rifles raised. Her heart slammed against her ribs as the door burst open, wood splintering under a battering ram. Officers stormed in, boots pounding, voices barking orders. "Nia Jackson, you're under arrest!" a burly commander bellowed, his face obscured by a helmet visor. She stumbled back, hands raised, her voice cutting through the chaos. "For what?" He grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back, cuffs snapping on with a cold click that echoed the night at the docks. "Her assaulting an officer," he growled, shoving her toward the door. Jamal staggered downstairs, eyes wide, his jersey twisted from sleep. "Mom!" he yelled, lunging forward, but an officer blocked him, pinning him against the wall. "Stay." "Back, kid?" Nia twisted, her knee screaming, and met Jamal's gaze. "Call Lena now." He nodded, tears streaking his face as they dragged her outside. The lawn swarmed with cops, neighbors gawking from porches, phones filming the spectacle. Nia's mind raced, piecing it together. Assault? This was Carver, his retaliation for court, but how? They shoved her into a van, the door slamming shut, and she sat on a hard bench, cuffed hands trembling. The ride to the station was a blur, sirens wailing, her thoughts spinning. At the precinct, they marched her to an interrogation room, a stark box with a one-way mirror and a metal table bolted to the floor. The commander ripped off his helmet, revealing a scarred face and a sneer she recognized. Lieutenant Voss, Carver's old squad leader. He tossed a tablet onto the table, hitting play. Grainy body cam footage flickered, near at the docks, but twisted, edited. It showed her swinging at Carver, her voice dubbed with threats, "I'll kill you." The timestamp matched her arrest, but the scene was a lie, her real words replaced, her refusal morphed into violence. She stared, bile rising in her throat. "That's fake," she said, voice steady despite the shock. "He doctored it." Voss smirked, leaning close, his breath sour with tobacco. "Looks real to me." "You're done, lady." She glared back, nails digging into her palms. "I'm the chief prosecutor. You think this'll hold up?" He laughed, a dry rasp. "Not after the news gets it." They booked her again, fingerprints smudging ink onto her hands, her mugshot flashing across screens before she could blink. By noon, the media erupted. "Chief prosecutor attacks cop," the headline screamed, the fake video looping on every channel. Her office called, voice cold. "You're suspended pending investigation." She sat in a cell, the same dripping pipe mocking her, her sweater damp with sweat. Carver had struck back, not with fists, but with a lie so bold it could ruin her. Hours later, Lena bailed her out, her face tight with fury. "They're burying us," she whispered in the station lobby, handing Nia a burner phone. "But I've got something." They ducked into a diner across the street, its vinyl booth sticky with grease, the air humming with fryer noise. Lena slid a USB drive across the table. Found a tech at the precinct. Carver paid him $2,000 to splice that video. "Proof's here." Nia clutched it, a lifeline in her fist, her knee throbbing as she leaned forward. "Good. We'll use it." Lena frowned, eyes darting to the window. "Your team's wavering. Clients pulling out. This hit hard." Nia's chest tightened, guilt clawing at her. She'd thought the lawsuit would corner Carver, that the knife's prints would seal it. Now she was framed, her career teetering, Jamal caught in the crossfire. She stood, wincing, resolve hardening. "I'll expose him. Get me a press conference." Lena nodded, but doubt lingered in her gaze. Nia limped to her car, the burner buzzing with a text from Jamal. "School's talking. I'm scared." She closed her eyes, the weight of his fear crushing her. She'd won in court, thought she'd struck a blow, but Carver had turned it against her, his racist vendetta now a forged blade. Back home, she locked the doors, checking windows, the boarded-up back still a scar. She plugged the USB into her laptop, watching the text confession. "Carver told me to make her look crazy. Said she didn't belong here." Her blood boiled, the truth a weapon she'd wield. She'd thought she was gaining ground, rebuilding from the invasion. She was wrong. This was deeper, dirtier, a system shielding him, amplifying the hate. She'd fight, expose the bribe, claw her way back. But as she sat, the fake video replayed in her mind, her own face twisted into a monster. Carver had outplayed her, and her allies were slipping away. She'd strike back, but the cost was mounting, and the war was far from won. What do you make of Carver's dirty game? Comment number 1 if you think Nia can still turn this around. Hit like if her grit keeps you hooked, and subscribe to see her next move against this racist trap. Did she underestimate Carver's reach, or is this the spark that'll burn him down? What happens when the mob he stirred comes knocking? The sun dipped low over Stoneport, casting long shadows across the town square. A cracked concrete slab ringed by sagging storefronts and a rusted fountain that hadn't run in years. Nia Jackson stood on a makeshift stage, her black sweater clinging to her sweat-damp skin, her knee brace hidden under jeans that chafed her bruised leg. A crowd of hundreds stretched before her, faces a mix of fury and hope, their signs bobbing. "Justice for Nia. End the hate." She gripped a megaphone, her voice steady despite the ache in her ribs from the home invasion, the weight of the fake video still looping in her mind. She'd called this rally to fight back, to expose Carver's bribe, the USB burning a hole in her pocket. "I'm not the villain here," she said, words crackling through the air. "Trent Carver framed me, paid to twist the truth, because he can't stand a black woman with power." The crowd roared, fists pumping, and she felt a surge, a flicker of victory. Jamal stood at the stage's edge, his lanky frame tense, eyes scanning the sea of people. She'd begged him to stay home, but he'd insisted, "I'm with you, Mom." She'd thought this was her moment, a tide turning against Carver's lies. She was wrong. A low rumble cut through the cheers, growing louder, closer, until a pickup truck screeched around the corner, its tires spitting gravel, a Confederate flag flapping from the bed. The crowd faltered, murmurs rippling as it barreled toward the stage, horn blaring like a war cry. Nia dropped the megaphone, instinct kicking in, and grabbed Jamal's arm, pulling him back. "Get down," she yelled, but the truck didn't stop. It swerved, slamming into a row of chairs, metal crunching, screams erupting as people scattered. The tailgate dropped, and a mob poured out, a dozen men in hoodies and caps, faces twisted with rage, wielding bats and bottles. They charged, shouting, slurs that hit Nia like shrapnel. "Go back to the gutter. You don't belong here." She shoved Jamal behind her, her knee buckling as she braced for the onslaught. The first thug swung a bat, missing her by inches, the wood splintering against the stage. She ducked, grabbing a fallen signpost, its jagged edge a makeshift shield. "Stay back," she shouted, swinging it, catching a man's arm with a crack. He howled, dropping his bottle, glass shattering across the concrete. The crowd fought back, some hurling fists, others fleeing. But the attackers were relentless, a swarm fueled by hate. A brick sailed from nowhere, grazing Nia's temple, blood streaming warm and sticky down her cheek. She staggered, vision blurring, but held Jamal close, his gasps hot against her neck. "Mom, we gotta go," he pleaded, tugging her arm. She nodded, limping toward the stage's rear, when a bottle smashed at her feet, shards slicing her ankle. Pain flared, but she pushed on, the mob's roars deafening. Sirens wailed in the distance, faint against the chaos, and she glanced back, seeing bodies on the ground, blood pooling, signs trampled. The attackers swung wildly, breaking noses, cracking ribs, their slurs a vicious chant. She reached the alley behind the stage, shoving Jamal ahead, her breath ragged. "Run to the car." He hesitated, eyes wide with terror, but bolted when she pushed him again. She followed, her knee screaming, blood dripping into her eye, staining her sweater crimson. The truck revved, peeling out, and the mob scattered, melting into the dusk as police lights flashed closer. Nia collapsed against a dumpster, chest heaving, Jamal crouching beside her. "You okay?" he whispered, voice trembling. She nodded, wiping blood with her sleeve, though every muscle ached. "Yeah, you?" He hugged her, shaking, and she held him tight, fury boiling beneath her pain. Cops swarmed the square, too late, their boots crunching glass as they barked orders. She recognized Hargrove and Diaz among them, Carver's cronies, their faces smug as they surveyed the wreckage. Hargrove sauntered over, bald head gleaming, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Rough day, huh? Looks like a riot." Nia stood, wincing, her tone lethal. "This was an attack. You saw it." He shrugged, kicking a broken bottle. "Saw a crowd get rowdy. Happens." Diaz smirked, jotting notes. "We'll call it a disturbance, no arrests." She pointed at the blood, the slurs scratched into the stage. "That's evidence of a hate crime. Do your job." Hargrove's smirk faded, but he turned away, muttering into his radio. She knew they'd bury it, just like the knife, just like the invasion. Her phone buzzed, a news alert. Prosecutor Sparks riot at rally. The story twisted it, blaming her. The truck's flag cropped from photos, the attackers faceless ghosts. She clenched her fists, nails biting her palms. This was Carver, his whispers igniting the mob, his reach turning her stand into a bloodbath. She'd rallied hundreds, thought she'd won hearts, but he'd flipped it, made her the villain again. She limped to her car, Jamal trailing, the cracked windshield a cruel mirror to her battered state. She drove home, the square's chaos replaying in her head. The bats swing, the bricks sting, the slurs carving deeper than any weapon. She'd stood tall, thought she'd struck a blow, but Carver had countered, his racist fury now a physical storm. At home, she locked the doors, checking windows, the boarded up back a grim reminder. Jamal sank onto the couch, staring at his hands, and she knelt beside him, ignoring her knee's protest. "We're still fighting," she said, voice firm. "This doesn't stop us." He nodded, but his eyes were hollow, the weight of hate pressing on him. She stood, grabbing her laptop, pulling up the rally footage amateurs had posted online. It showed the truck, the flag, the mob, raw and unfiltered, a truth the news wouldn't touch. She'd use it, expose Carver's hand, rally again. But as she watched, a chill settled in her gut. Hargrove's smirk, Diaz's notes, they weren't just covering up, they were gloating. Carver was untouchable, his voice booming on a TV interview she flicked on. She's dangerous. Look what she caused. The anchor nodded, and Nia's blood ran cold. She'd thought she was winning, turning the tide. She was wrong. This was his game, and he'd played it brutal, leaving her bloody, her cause twisted, her son shaken. She'd fight, but the mob's hate lingered, a shadow growing, darker, and Carver's next move loomed like a storm on the horizon. The sky over Stoneport hung heavy with bruised clouds, a late afternoon gloom settling over Nia Jackson's seaside home like a shroud. Inside, the air was stale with the ghosts of smoke and paint, the boarded-up back door a jagged scar against the pale walls. Nia sat at her desk in the office nook, her black sweater streaked with dried blood from the rally, her knee brace creaking as she shifted. A bottle of aspirin sat open beside her cracked laptop, the screen glowing with raw footage of the mob ambush, the truck's Confederate flag, the bats swinging, the slurs echoing. She'd salvaged what she could, her hands still raw from scrubbing hate off her walls, her temple throbbing where the brick had grazed her. Jamal slumped on the couch nearby, his lanky frame curled under a blanket, eyes fixed on his phone, scrolling through the venom online. She'd sent him to a friend's after the rally, but he'd come back, refusing to leave her side. "We're in this together," he'd said, voice quiet but firm. She'd nodded, guilt gnawing at her, and turned, back to her fight. Her deputy, Marcus Tate, 40 and wiry with a quick smile, had called an hour ago promising dirt on Carver. "I've got his past," he'd said. "Disciplinary records, complaints, meet me at the office." She'd felt a spark, a lifeline after the mob's chaos. She'd thought she could trust him, rebuild her stand. She was wrong. Nia limped into her office building at dusk, the glass walls reflecting the bay's restless waves, the bullpen empty save for a janitor sweeping in the corner. Her knee ached, her sweater hid the bloodstains, but her head was high, the USB of Carver's bribe tucked in her pocket. Marcus waited in her corner office, leaning against her desk, his navy blazer crisp, his dark eyes flickering with something she couldn't place. "So look like hell," he said, voice light, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. She sank into her chair, wincing. "Feel like it. What have you got?" He slid a folder across, thick with yellowed pages. Carver's file. 3 suspensions. All hushed up. Racial profiling, excessive force, he's dirty. She flipped it open, scanning dates, names, a pattern of hate stretching back years. Her pulse quickened, a weapon forming. "This is gold, we'll bury him." Marcus nodded, pacing to the window, hands in his pockets. "Yeah, Lena's tech proof ties it to the video. You've got him." She leaned back, relief washing over her, a crack in Carver's armor. "Good. Press conference tomorrow. We'll hit hard." He turned, his expression shifting, a shadow crossing his face. "You sure you can pull this off? After the rally?" She frowned, sensing an edge. "I've got no choice. He's not stopping." Marcus nodded slowly, then left, promising to dig deeper. She stayed, poring over the file, hope flickering. She'd thought he was her rock, her edge against Carver. She was wrong. That night, she flicked on the TV, needing noise to drown the silence, and froze. Marcus's face filled the screen, standing beside a podium, his blazer swapped for a suit, his voice smooth as he spoke to a news crew. "Nia Jackson's corrupt," he said, holding up forged documents, signatures she'd never written. "She's been skimming funds, faking cases. I've got proof." The anchor cut to the papers, bank statements, emails, all lies, branding her a thief. Nia's stomach plummeted, her hands trembling as she grabbed her phone. Texts flooded in. Colleagues bailing, clients cancelling. Lena's panicked. "What's happening?" She dialed Marcus, but it went to voicemail, his cheerful greeting mocking her. The news looped. Chief Prosecutor exposed. Her rally footage now evidence of instability. She sank to the floor, the folder slipping from her lap, her knee brace digging into her skin. This was Carver, his counterstrike, but Marcus, her ally, her friend, bought off. She scrambled to her laptop, pulling up security logs, and found a deposit. $5,000 to Marcus's account, time-stamped yesterday from an offshore shell. Carver owns this town, he'd written in a note she found tucked in the folder, left like a taunt. Her allies deserted her, phones silent, emails cold. She called Jamal's school and the principal's voice was clipped. He's expelled. Safety concerns after the riot. She slammed the phone down, fury and despair warring in her chest. She'd rallied, fought, thought Marcus would bolster her. Now she was alone, her career gutted, her son punished for her stand. She limped to the couch, pulling Jamal close, his eyes red. "Why is he doing this?" he whispered. "Because I scared them," she said, voice hard. "But I'm not done." She grabbed the burner, texting Lena, "Marcus flipped, need you." She'd thought she had an edge, a team. She was wrong. The TV blared on, Marcus's betrayal, a knife in her back, Carver's smirk lurking behind. "Tit." She stood wincing and opened her laptop, pulling up the rally footage again. She'd go online, post the truth, fight alone if she had to. Her office was a battlefield now, her home a fortress breached, and her son's future dangled by a thread. She'd expose Marcus, link him to Carver, claw her way back. But as she typed, the screen flickered, a news alert popping up. Jackson's deputy testifies to corruption. Her breath caught, the room spinning. Carver had turned her win into ash, her trust into a trap, and her fight into a noose. She'd rally again, but the cost was crippling. And his next blow loomed, a shadow she couldn't outrun. How do you see Marcus's betrayal hitting Nia? Comment number 1 if you think she'll rise above this stab in the back. Hit like if her grit keeps you on edge. And subscribe to catch her next stand against Carver's game. Can she rebuild from this wreckage? Or has Carver's hate finally broken her spirit? What's his next play when she's got nothing left to lose? Night draped Stoneport in a thick inky veil, the coastal wind howling through the cliffs, rattling the boarded-up back door of Nia Jackson's home. Inside, the living room glowed faintly from a single lamp, casting jagged shadows across the walls still scarred from the invasion. Nia sat at her desk, her black sweater stained with rally blood, her knee brace creaking as she shifted. Her cracked laptop hummed, uploading raw rally footage to a burner account online, a desperate bid to counter Marcus's betrayal. The screen flickered with comments, some supportive, most venomous, slurs piling up like bricks on her chest. Jamal slept upstairs, his door cracked open, his soft breathing a fragile anchor in the storm. She'd locked every window, checked every bolt, turning her house into a fortress after the mob's chaos, and Marcus's knife in her back. She'd posted the text confession too, linking Carver to the fake video, and watched shares climb, a thin thread of hope weaving through the hate. She'd thought she was regaining trust, clawing back ground. She was wrong. The upload hit 90% when her phone buzzed, a text from Lena. "Press conference set. We've got traction." Nia exhaled, a flicker of relief easing the knot in her gut. She stood, wincing as her knee protested, and grabbed her keys. She'd drive to the office, meet Lena, solidify their plan. She pulled on a coat, the USB of Carver's bribe safe in her pocket, and stepped outside, the sea air biting her face. Her car sat in the driveway, its cracked windshield a battle scar, the brick's note still echoing in her mind. "Know your lane." She slid in, the engine growling to life, and backed out, headlights slicing through the dark. The coastal road stretched ahead, a narrow ribbon hugging the cliffs, waves crashing below. She'd driven 5 miles, the town's lights fading in her rear view when a glint caught her eye. A flash from the hillside above. A crack split the night sharp and final, and her windshield exploded, glass spraying like shrapnel. She screamed, swerving as a bullet punched through, grazing her shoulder, blood blooming hot and wet on her sweater. The car fishtailed, tires screeching against asphalt, and she slammed the brakes, the cliff's edge looming inches away. Her heart pounded, breath ragged as she ducked low, glass cutting her palms. Another shot rang out, pinging off the hood, and she fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "Shots fired, coastal road, mile marker 8, she yelled, voice breaking as the operator's calm reply droned. She dropped the phone, peering through the shattered windshield, and saw a shadow move, a figure in black retreating up the hill, rifle slung over a shoulder. She floored the gas, the car lurching forward, tires spinning as she raced for town, blood dripping. Down her arm, soaking her sleeve. The road blurred, her shoulder throbbing, but she gripped the wheel, refusing to stop. She reached a gas station 10 minutes later, its neon sign buzzing, and pulled in, tires crunching gravel. She stumbled out, blood streaking her coat, and banged on the locked door, the clerk's wide eyes staring through the glass. "Call the cops!" she shouted, collapsing against the wall, her breath a ragged sob. Sirens wailed, closing in, and 2 patrol cars screeched up, lights flashing. Hargrove and Diaz stepped out, Carver's cronies, their faces masks of false concern. "What's this now?" Hargrove drawled, his bald head glinting under the neon. Nia pointed at her car, voice hoarse. "Someone shot at me. Sniper on the hill." Diaz crouched by the bullet hole, his sharp eyes narrowing, then stood with a shrug. "Looks like road rage happens out here." She glared, blood dripping onto the pavement. "Road rage with a rifle? That's a hit. Check the hill." Hargrove smirked, jotting notes. "We'll look. Probably nothing." They bagged the bullet, a slug lodged in the dashboard, but she saw Diaz pocket a casing, his smirk a silent taunt. They left, promising a report, and she knew it'd vanish. Buried. Like the knife, the invasion, the rally. She drove home, shoulder bandaged by a gas station first aid kit, the clerk's shaky hands her only help. The house was silent, Jamal still asleep, oblivious to the blood on her sleeve. She locked the door, sinking onto the couch, her phone, buzzing with a blocked number. She answered, voice trembling. "Who's this?" A low laugh crackled through, Carver's voice unmistakable. "Next time, you're gone," he said, then hung up. She dropped the phone, her shoulder burning, her mind racing. This was him, his escalation. A racist vendetta turned lethal. She'd posted the truth, thought she'd regained ground, but he'd countered with a bullet, his reach deeper than she'd feared. She checked on Jamal, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt a stab of dread. He was her world, and Carver knew. She'd survived, but the car's wreckage sat outside, a smoking gun they'd dismiss. She grabbed her laptop, pulling up the sniper's vantage. A ridge owned by a shell company, untraceable without a fight. Lena texted, "Heard about the shot. You okay?" She replied, "Barely. Need a PI." She thought she was safe, driving, home with hope. She was wrong. The house felt like a cage now, every creak a threat, Jamal's safety dangling by a thread. She bandaged her shoulder tighter, wincing as blood seeped through, and sat by his door, listening to his breaths. She'd expose the shell, link it to Carver, fight with every breath. But as she sat, the bullet's whistle echoed in her ears, a promise of worse to come. Carver wasn't just a cop, he was a hunter, and she was prey, her rally's echo now, a target on her back. She'd survived, but the war had turned deadly, and his next shot might not miss. The dawn broke over Stoneport with a blood-red streak, the sky mirroring the tension coiled in Nia Jackson's chest. Her seaside home was a fortress now, windows barred, the back door's boards reinforced with steel braces she'd hammered in herself. She stood in the living room, her black sweater stiff with dried blood. A fresh bandage wrapped tight around her grazed shoulder, the sniper's bullet still burning in her memory. Jamal paced behind her, his lanky frame restless, eyes shadowed, from a sleepless night. "Mom, you sure about this?" he asked, voice low, his basketball jersey wrinkled from clutching it in fear. She nodded, her knee brace creaking as she adjusted her stance, her cracked laptop open on the coffee table. "We've got no choice," she said, voice firm despite the ache in her bones. She'd spent the night leaking audio from the texts, confession online, tying Carver to the fake video, and now she'd organized a massive rally, thousands strong, set for noon in the town square. "We expose him or he wins." Jamal frowned but stayed close, her shadow in this war. She'd survived the sniper, thought she was reclaiming power. She was wrong. The square buzzed by 11, a sea of faces stretching past the rusted fountain. Spilling into the alleys, their chants a thunderous pulse. "Justice now!" Nia stood on a new stage, higher this time, flanked by Lena and a handful of loyalists, her voice booming through a microphone wired to speakers that rattled the storefronts. She wore a clean grey blazer, hiding her bandages, her temple still, bruised from the rally brick. Trent Carver framed me, shot at me because I dared to stand up, she shouted, holding up the USB, its silver glinting in the sun. This proves he bribed a tech to lie, to silence me. The crowd roared, thousands of fists raised, signs waving. End corruption. Nia fights for us. She played the audio, the tech's voice crackling out. Carver paid me to fake it, said she's a threat. Cheers erupted, a tidal wave of support, and she felt it, a surge of strength, her cause reborn. Lena squeezed her arm, whispering, "We've got him." Jamal stood at the stage's edge, filming it all, pride flickering in his eyes. She'd thought this was her stand, her victory rising from the ashes. She was wrong. A low hum cut through. The noise, a vibration she felt in her chest before she heard it growing into a roar. The crowd stilled, heads turning, and then it happened. A deafening blast, a fireball blooming at the square's edge near the old bakery. The stage shook, wood splintering as the shockwave hit, hurling Nia backward. She landed hard, her shoulder, screaming, blood seeping through her bandage as screams tore through the air. Smoke billowed thick and black, choking her as she scrambled up, ears ringing, vision blurred. Bodies littered the ground, 15 at least, their signs burning, blood pooling on the concrete. She staggered forward, coughing, and saw Lena crumpled nearby, her arm twisted, face pale. "Lena!" Nia yelled, dropping beside her, shaking, her still form. "Stay with me," Lena groaned, alive, and Nia's heart lurched, relief warring with horror. Jamal stumbled through the haze, his jersey torn, eyes wild. "Mom!" he cried, grabbing her arm, pulling her up. "We've got to go!" She resisted, scanning the carnage, her voice raw. "Who did this?" Sirens wailed, distant but closing, as survivors screamed, some fleeing, others cradling the wounded. She spotted a charred fragment near the blast. A pipe bomb, its jagged, metal glinting. Her gut twisted, Carver's taunt echoing, "Next time you're gone." This was him, his racist wrath turned apocalyptic. Police swarmed in, Hargrove and Diaz at the front, their faces grim but eyes cold. Hargrove barked orders, his bald head slick with sweat, while Diaz knelt by the bomb, pocketing a piece before anyone saw. Nia lunged, her knee buckling, voice hoarse. "That's evidence, you're covering for him." Hargrove smirked, shoving her back. "Back off, Jackson, this is a crime scene." She fell, glass cutting her palms, and glared up, blood dripping. "You know who did this." He turned away, radio crackling, and she knew they'd bury it like always. Hours later, she sat in a precinct cell, the same dripping pipe mocking her, her blazer torn, blood caking her hands. Jamal was outside with Lena, safe but shaken, while Nia faced Voss, Carver's scarred lieutenant. He tossed a laptop onto the table, hitting play. An email popped up, forged in her name. "Set the bomb, show them." She stared, bile rising, the words a lie stamped with her digital signature. "That's fake," she said, voice trembling with rage. "He planted it." Voss grinned, tobacco staining his teeth. "Looks real. You're a terrorist now." The news hit like a tidal wave. "Jackson bombs rally," the headline screamed. Her face plastered everywhere, the crowd's blood pinned on her. She stood, banging on the bars, screaming, "I'm innocent." But the cell swallowed her voice, the drip-drip her only answer. Carver's frame-up was complete, his vendetta, a massacre that flipped her stand into a nightmare. She'd rallied thousands, thought she'd exposed him, but he'd countered with a bomb, 15 dead. Her friend broken, her name cursed. The town turned, chants outside the precinct shifting to "murderer" as rocks pelted the walls. She sank to the bench, head in her hands, the weight crushing her. She'd survived the sniper, thought she'd reclaimed power with the rally's roar. She was wrong. This was his endgame, a racist slaughter to bury her, his cronies sealing the lie. She'd fought with truth, rallied with hope, but he'd turned it to ash, her innocence a whisper against his roar. She looked up, the cell's dim light catching tears she refused to shed, and saw Carver through the bars, perched on a balcony, across the street, smirking down. He'd won this round, his hate a bomb that shattered her world, and she was trapped, bloody and screaming, with no way out. The max security cell in Stoneport's precinct was a concrete tomb, its walls slick with damp, the air heavy with the stench of mold and despair. Nia Jackson sat on a metal bench, her grey blazer torn at the shoulder, blood caking her hands. From the rally bombing, her knee brace cutting into her swollen leg. The dripping pipe from her first night here mocked her again, a relentless tap that synced with her racing pulse. She was branded a terrorist now, the town's chants of "murderer" echoing through the barred window. 15 deaths pinned on her by Carver's forged email. Her shoulder throbbed where the sniper had grazed her temple bruised from the mob's brick, but her eyes burned with a fire that refused to die. Jamal was safe with Lena, her only lifeline, while she rotted here, caged by a lie. She'd rallied thousands, thought she'd exposed Carver's hate. She was wrong. A guard shuffled past, his keys jangling, and dropped his phone, the screen lighting up with a news ticker. Jackson faces life. She lunged, snatching it before he turned, her cuffed hands fumbling to text Lena, "Need a hacker, now." She slid it back as he spun, grumbling, oblivious to her move. Hours crept by, the cell growing colder, her breath fogging in the dim light. She paced, 3 steps one way, 3 back, her mind churning. Carver's smirk from the balcony haunted her, his victory a noose tightening. Then chaos erupted, shouts down the hall, a clang of metal, smoke seeping under the door. A riot, prisoners banging trays, guards yelling. She pressed against the bars, heart pounding, as a figure darted through the haze. Lena's hacker, a wiry kid with a shaved head, picking the lock with a tool he'd smuggled in. "Move!" he hissed, the door swinging open. She stumbled out, cuffs clanking, and ran, smoke stinging her eyes, the kid guiding her through twisting corridors. Alarms blared, boots thundered, but they slipped through a service exit. The night. Air hitting her like a slap. She limped to a stolen bike the kid had stashed, her knee screaming as she swung on, the hacker vanishing into the dark. She knew where to go. Carver's beach house, a glass-walled perch on the cliffs, his lair of power. She'd end this, expose him, or die trying. The ride was a blur, wind tearing at her torn blazer, blood seeping through her bandage, the bike's engine a growl against the crashing waves. She ditched it a mile out, limping through scrub and sand, the house glowing ahead, its sleek lines mocking her ruin. She'd thought the rally was her stand, her truth breaking his lies. She was wrong. Carver stood on the deck, a tumbler of whiskey in hand, his buzzcut glinting under floodlights, his broad frame relaxed, untouchable. She crept closer, her burner phone from Lena in her pocket, recording live to a stream she'd set up in the cell. Thousands watched, the counter ticking up her last gamble. She stepped into the light, voice raw but steady. "It's over, Carver." He turned, smirk curling, unfazed, and set the glass down with a clink. "You're a ghost now, Jackson. Should have stayed dead." She held up the phone, its red dot blinking. "The world's watching. Tell them why you bombed the rally." He laughed, a low guttural sound, and pulled a gun from his waistband, its barrel gleaming. "You think they'll believe a terrorist? I own this town." She stepped closer, cuffs dangling, blood dripping onto the deck. "You paid for the video, sent the mob, shot at me, bombed the square, say it." His smirk faded, eyes narrowing, but he cocked the gun, aiming at her chest. "You're nothing, a black nobody who got too loud. I did it all. Video, mob, sniper, bomb. 15 dead to shut you up, and I'd do it again." His voice was ice, every word a confession, the stream spiking to millions. She stood tall, her knee trembling, recording his hate, her proof at last. He pulled the trigger, the shot cracking the night, and pain exploded in her side, blood soaking her blazer as she fell, the phone skittering across the wood. She gasped, vision swimming, but saw him loom closer, gun raised again. "Goodbye, Jackson," he snarled, finger tightening. Then sirens wailed, lights flashing up the cliff road, cops swarming, not his cronies but state troopers drawn by the stream. He froze, gun wavering as they shouted, "Drop it!" She rolled, clutching her side, blood pooling, and grabbed the phone, holding it up, her voice a rasp. He confessed, "It's live." Carver roared, lunging, but troopers tackled him, his gun clattering away, his buzz cut scraping the deck as they cuffed him. Nia lay back, breath shallow, the phone slipping from her hand, the stream still rolling, millions watching her bleed. She'd thought she'd expose him, end his war. She was wrong. The troopers yelled for a medic, their voices fading as her eyes fluttered. The seas crash, a distant lullaby. She'd fought, rallied, escaped, faced him down. But the bullet in her side was his last word, her victory teetering on death. She'd recorded his confession, broken his empire, but her blood stained the deck, her breath fading, and she wondered if Jamal would see this, if he'd forgive her for the cost. The troopers swarmed, radios crackling, but she drifted, the phone's light dimming, her stand complete yet unraveling, a final blow in a war she'd never truly win. The sterile hum of Stoneport General's operating room swallowed Nia Jackson's fading breaths, the cold steel table biting into her back as surgeons swarmed, their gloved hands slick with her blood. The bullet from Carver's gun had torn, through her side, a jagged wound that painted her torn grey blazer crimson, her vision a haze of white lights and masked faces. Pain seared, a wildfire in her gut, but her mind clung to the phone stream, millions watching Trent Carver's confession, the video, the mob, the sniper, the bomb, all his racist venom laid bare. She'd faced him on that deck, thought she'd won as troopers cuffed him, his buzz cut scraping the wood, his empire crumbling. She was wrong. Her pulse weakened, monitors beeping a frantic rhythm as a surgeon barked, "She's crashing!" Her needle pierced her arm, cold fluid flooding her veins, and darkness pulled her under. The last sound, the clatter of tools. The last thought, Jamal's face, safe with Lena. Outside, Stoneport burned, the stream sparking riots that lit the night, flames licking the precinct's brick walls, crowds smashing windows with bricks and bottles chanting "Justice." Carver's arrest flashed on every screen, his pale blue eyes wild as troopers dragged him away, his confession a viral bomb that shattered his reign. Nia drifted in the void, her body a battlefield, surgeons stitching her back to life, her victory a fragile thread. She'd thought this was the end, her stand complete. She was wrong. Days blurred into a haze of morphine and antiseptic, her eyes fluttering open to a hospital room, its beige walls stark under fluorescent buzz. Tubes snaked from her arm, her side bandaged tight, pain a dull roar she could taste. Lena sat beside her, face drawn, her voice soft. "You made it." Carver's locked up, facing trial. The stream hit 10 million. Nia nodded, throat dry, a faint smile tugging her lips. "We got him." Lena squeezed her hand, but her eyes flickered, something unsaid. "Rest. You've done enough." Nia sank back, relief washing over her. The war won, her name cleared. She'd thought she'd paid the price, survived his hate. She was wrong. The TV flickered on, a news anchor's voice cutting through. "Breaking. Stoneport precinct bombed. Dozens dead." Her heart stopped, eyes locking on the screen as footage rolled. The precinct a smoldering ruin, flames devouring desks, bodies strewn across the lot. Carver's cell a crater. The anchor continued. Suspect, Jamal Jackson, 16, son of Chief Prosecutor Nia Jackson. Nia's breath caught, a scream trapped in her chest as a grainy photo flashed. Jamal, her Jamal in his basketball jersey, tossing a Molotov, his face twisted with rage. She ripped the IV from her arm, blood dripping, and stumbled up. Pain exploding, but Lena grabbed her, pinning her down. "Nia, stop, you're hurt!" Nia thrashed, voice raw. "Where is he?" Lena's eyes filled, her grip tightening. "Gone. He thought you died. The stream cut when you fell, and he snapped." Nia froze, the room spinning, her son's soft snores from nights past echoing in her skull. He'd seen her bleed, thought Carver won, and turned her fight into his vengeance, a bomb that killed dozens, Carver included. She sank back, tears burning, the weight crushing her. She'd exposed him, broken his empire, but this was the cost. Her boy, radicalized by her death, a fugitive in her name. The door creaked open, and the judge from her first trial stepped in, his hawkish nose sharper in the dim light, his glasses glinting. He stood over her, voice low, almost a whisper. "You're awake, good." She glared, pain and grief warring in her chest. "What do you want?" He leaned closer, his breath stale, and dropped the bomb. "I funded Carver. To test you. Needed to see if you'd break. You didn't, but this..." He gestured to the TV, Jamal's face frozen on screen. "This is your legacy now." Her blood ran cold, his words a knife twisting deeper than the bullet. He'd freed her in court, dismissed the charges, but it was a lie, a game to push her, and she'd played it, dragging Jamal into the abyss. She lunged, hands clawing for his throat, but pain buckled her and she fell back, gasping. He straightened, unperturbed. "Justice reigns, Nia, but at what cost?" He left, the door clicking shut, leaving her with the TV's drone, the precincts. Ashes, her son's crime. She'd thought she'd won, brought accountability, sparked change. She was wrong. The riots raged on, her name a martyr's cry, protests swelling across the state. Carver's confession fueling reforms, oversight boards, body cams, his cronies probed. Hargrove and Diaz faced trials, Voss's scars televised as he cuffed them. She'd dismantled the system, her blood the price, but Jamal's bomb rewrote it all, a pyrrhic victory soaked in chaos. She lay there staring at the ceiling, pain a dull pulse, her legacy a paradox. Justice born of hate, change from ruin. She'd fought, escaped, faced Carver down, but the judge's whisper and Jamal's act flipped it, her triumph a curse. She closed her eyes, the hospital's hum fading, and saw Jamal's grin from a basketball game now lost to her, a fugitive she'd never hold again. She'd won the war, but lost her soul, and Stoneport would never be the same. Nia Jackson's journey in racist cop arrests wrong black woman. He's shocked in court to learn she's the state's chief prosecutor, reveals harsh truths about resilience, justice, and the cost of fighting systemic hate. Her battle against Trent Carver teaches that standing up to racism often demands everything. Home, safety, even family. Nia's relentless spirit shows that courage can topple empires as she exposes Carver's corruption despite his escalating attacks from arrests to bombings. Yet the story's twist, Jamal's radicalization and the judge's manipulation, underscores a brutal lesson. Victories against injustice can breed unintended chaos. Her triumph dismantles a racist system, sparking reforms, but leaves her son a fugitive, her legacy tainted. It's a stark reminder that the fight for right isn't clean or linear. It's a jagged path where personal loss can outweigh public. Nia's story also exposes the fragility of trust. Marcus's betrayal and the judge's scheme highlight how allies can become weapons in the hands of hate. Ultimately, it teaches that justice is a journey, not a destination, requiring unwavering resolve even when the cost feels unbearable. What resonates most is the duality. Nia's strength inspires, but her tragedy warns. How do we balance the fight with its fallout? That's the challenge this tale leaves us with, a call to reflect on our own battles and their ripple effects. What do you take from Nia's war? Comment below if her grit moves you, hit like if this twist shook you, and subscribe and share to keep these stories alive. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength in your own fight for justice.